The presentation I'm giving today on the work we did as part of more on policy and regulatory framework was done together with Parnika Ray, my colleague from Sciences Po, who's sitting in the room, but also with Simon Morgan from Buchanan Computing, who you'll hear later on this afternoon, Meha Shukla, and Dr. Jenny MacArthur from UCL. So the main point, I guess, I want to bring forward with this presentation is to go back a little bit to what Paolo was saying a few minutes ago, highlighting the fact that thinking about how to shift from movement towards place is not just a technical issue, it's also a political one. And indeed, it is also about how we think in terms of regulation, policy, and governance at the end of the day. So in order to make this shift from movement towards place, there are a number of political challenges and opportunities that city authorities have to deal with. Some of them have to do with new demands and uses and technologies, but I won't get too much into this. Some of those challenges have to do with regulatory settings. But there's also a number of institutional, organizational, and political arrangements that have to be done. And coming back to what told us this morning, governance is also about making those important choices and leading in order to show what is the key direction that a city wants to do. So governance will be about ensuring coordination, and in order to ensure this coordination, you have to make some important choices in order to bring those different interests all together. So just to start and maybe to begin with what are the urban road space or the way it is being managed in the wider national and regional context. When we started working on more, I think a lot of the feedback we got from the colleagues from the different cities was to say that there were indeed lots of different ways to think about regulatory frameworks. So there's this taxonomy of regulation, as my colleague Simon Morgan would say. There's regulation about availability of the road network, about the driving, managing the curbside, so a number of different ways to think about regulation. However, within the context of the EU, even though we may think this is something that should be addressed already at this stage of EU integration process, there still are a great number of variations among different countries in the way through which regulatory frameworks are being dealt with. There has been some harmonizing of standards and regulation, but it also remains quite superficial in terms of synchronizing what the different forms and appearances to road users are. So there still are some significant differences from one country to the other. One of the cases we could find, for example, is the fact that the end of speed limit zone in Sweden is not indicated by any sign, as opposed to to the situation observed in other countries, and we may have some significant differences between the UK, for example, and other countries on the continent. The second aspect has to do with the regulatory framework when it comes to urban spaces and urban road space, is that cities have become indeed very strategic nodes for a well-functioning TEN-T network. So they're being recognized as such. However, they still need to deal with, contrasting trends, one could say, and this is on the downside of my screen. There is a graph showing the different types of trends of traffic and incoming traffic in the case of Greater Manchester, showing the different types of vehicles that a city has to deal with, in this case a metropolitan area. And in order to be efficient strategic nodes, a well-functioning TEN-T urban node, cities are becoming more and more important in this context. First, there is a need to recognize them and to give them a greater involvement in the governance of the TEN-T network. And the second point that was made a few weeks ago only by the European Commission's Urban Mobility Framework communication is to push for a shift to moving people and goods more sustainably. And this also has some implication on the way through which the interconnection between TEN-T networks and the urban space function in practice. Last aspect of this urban road network is that it is indeed a very crowded regulatory space. And there again, when we started doing some work on with more cities, a lot of the colleagues from the cities came back arguing that yes, a number of those road networks are indeed still being managed by national authorities, by regional authorities. There's the private sector, which is sometimes involved, sometimes public, private, and we have a number of different regulatory authorities. And we did, together with my colleague Jenny MacArthur, a little bit of a mapping of the different types of regulations and regulatory authorities that come into the play, and this is what we show with the graph online. It just highlights the large diversity of authorities coming into play. The two main aspects here being that shared authority and ownership is still very much what is taking place in a number of European cities, meaning that in order to think about shifting your regulatory framework towards a movement, towards a placemaking context, well, it usually needs a number of coordination across levels of government. And there is, on top of this, institutional fragmentation between those levels of government in terms of what they want to achieve as a policy priority. Policy priorities may not be always aligned between a national government, maybe pushing for a movement approach, and that of city authorities. So I'm still talking about the barriers and the challenges, but I will come to the solutions in a moment. But I think it's still important to highlight what were the number of barriers and the challenges faced by city authorities when they want to move from movement towards place. And I guess this is also why we've been working on governance. You know, we've been talking a lot about solutions and defensive technologies, but I guess governance is really about how do you deal with the pipelines, you know, the political pipelines, the administrative ones, the budgetary ones. So this is what we were mainly looking at in this level. And there are indeed two different types of barriers that we could identify as part of more. And I think it's very important for cities and city authorities who wish to make that shift go from movement towards placemaking to have those two levels of barriers in mind. The first type of barriers have to do with strategic planning, has to do with the strategic and the planning level. In this case, the main point is to reshuffle your policy priorities as part of a planning document or mobility action plan, for example, to ensure that car reduction indeed maybe becomes one of your main priority in a given strategic plan. There also are some institutional and organizational barriers that we could identify, either because there are some tensions between different policy priorities across levels of government, but also because in a number of cities across Europe, there still are quite weak planning capacities, and for strategic planning, more specifically at metropolitan level. So it is also about bringing all the different municipalities within one single region on a single line in order to co-develop and jointly develop those policy objectives. So weak powers for strategic planning, especially at metropolitan level. And in more, we have some cities such as Budapest and London, who has long experience with that, and cities such as Lisbon, who started working on this issue a few years ago. We also could identify some political barriers which have a particularly strong role at the strategic and planning level that mainly have to do with disruption resulting from political cycles. So here again, I would align with Paul Smet. We're not necessarily pushing for more authoritarian approaches, but it's just that in a way you need to take this into account as a policymaker when you're developing your mobility and sustainable mobility planning over time. Disruption may result from political cycles. Politicians may or may not be interested in pushing these mobility ideas forward. And there also may be some issues regarding the centralization of power around the mayor's office in some cities, which means that for policymakers or organizations sitting outside the mayor's office or further out of his influence reach, then it might be more difficult to actually influence the way through which those decisions are being made. A second level of barriers has to do with implementation and the operational side of things. I mean, on the one hand, you could have those beautiful plans, you know, those beautiful strategic plans or SUMs that are all, you know, being nicely put on the shelf, but are not necessarily implemented. And this is where those barriers play out at implementation and operational level. And here we could identify as part of more has to do, on the one hand, with the limited standardization of policy practice when it comes to supporting new approaches to road space allocation. There was, for example, a need for more regulatory standards, but also for indicators in order to monitor and assess what cities have been doing and what progress was made. And this is what my colleague Regine Gericke from Technische Universität Dresden will be speaking of later. But there's also a need for guidelines for delivering those measures across departments that are usually organized in silo. We can also think about limited manpower and authority to actually implement and enforce. I mean, we've heard a lot about the way through which city authorities sometimes have difficulties to coordinate with police forces in order to implement and to enforce some of those guidelines. But we could also identify at that level, so the operational level, some limitations that have to do with data sharing, for example, or with coordinating between land use and transport planning. So those barriers are particularly strong at implementation and operational level, and they also add up to those barriers barriers that have to do to working beyond the public sector with private organizations or resulting from the rapid development of smart city technologies. This is what my colleague Meha Shukla from UCL works on, and she has been developing as part of MORE a lot of interesting insights about how smart products and applications or innovations and connectedness, but also smart street infrastructure particularly highlight the challenges between the rapid, those barriers resulting from the rapid development of new technologies. So how do cities make it work? I promised I would come to solutions, this is what I like to highlight. Cities, as part of MORE, making work in 5 different ways. They have developed some measures, first to strengthen leadership over the way through which those measures are being delivered. Champions here are not necessarily politicians. They could be politicians, but they could also be policy entrepreneurs. The head of an administration, for example, or an integrated transport agency, as we could see in Budapest, or in London, or in the case of Malmö. They also reshuffle their administrative structures. There's a lot of administrative reforms coming in here. It's not such a sexy theme, but sometimes it is something you have to do. If you want to push this agenda further, you need to accumulate policy resources, bring them under a single roof, and go through this important administrative reform, either at city level or at metropolitan level, in order to push for capacity building in a more structured way. Cities have also developed some design standards and indicators in order to strengthen the capacity at implementation and operational level, using national guidance materials on urban street design, as well as context-specific design. They also engage widely with their citizens and stakeholders groups in order to develop either some formalized or some informal space for dialogue with a variety of stakeholders, and this is where the work done by our colleagues from EIP comes into place. And they've also been developing some standards and international networking, one of them being to engage in EU networks in order to push for this agenda and to get some new ideas and best practice and engage in peer learning in order to strengthen their ability to work. So those are 5 of the different ways through which cities in MORE have been achieving this shift or are on the path to working on this. And I would like to finish with, this is my final slide. We tried here with my colleagues to summarize, what would it take for cities to become an urban street space manager? What does it take for a city in terms of governance? Well, we identified as part of MORE that it takes 4 different things. First is to maximize the opportunities and to minimize the risk by mainly drawing on your stakeholders' dialogue spaces. The second way is to take local initiative, a political act, to actively shift to placemaking. And this is where a number of experiments could lead the way, or some more overwhelming reforms. They can also adopt sustainable urban mobility policies, and this is what cities in MORE have been doing in Budapest, in Constanța, in London, in order to push for this agenda further. And finally, they can also draw on regulation in order to innovate and change what they're doing as part of parking, charging and enforcement, what they're doing in terms of congestion charging, London being a good example, and Lisbon as part of its shared mobility operators, working together with them in order to develop a new way to think about placemaking in the urban center. So I guess the conclusion on the positive side from this side of the work done as part of MORE is that there are a number of ways for cities to become active urban street space managers, to actually develop these policies, and we highlighted those 5 different factors and highlight what could be a good strategy. So I very much hope this will inspire other cities in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.